Welcome to the Point. In an election year that is sure to generate endless partisan arguments, something interesting is happening. Bipartisan groups are stepping forward to do everything from finding a third-party candidate to run for president, that group's called No Labels, to a national group intent on preserving our form of government called Keep Our Republic. The local arm of Keep Our Republic recently offered up two former members of the Michigan State House, one Democrat, one Republican, to talk about the common ground they now hope to work on to make sure voters are confident of their form of government and safety and security of their ballot. Here's that conversation. Gentlemen, thank you both for being here. Let's start with a little bit of history. Brandon Dillon, state representative, former chair of the Michigan Democratic Party, and frequent guest on the show. It's great to have you back.
It's great to be back. It's been a long time.
And Jerry Koyman, former member of the State House of Representatives, Majority Floor Leader,
Speaker Pro Tem.
Speaker Pro Tem, my apologies, Speaker Pro Tem. And most significantly, in the plaque on his wall in his home office, he was one of our first guests on the very first show of To The Point. It's great to have you both back and talk, and particularly about a subject that I'm very curious about. It's about a group called Keep Our Republic. So here we have lifelong Democrat, lifelong Republican, working together for a common goal. And Brandon, let's start with you. What is your take on this? What is Keep Our Republic?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, again, thanks for having both of us on, and I think it's interesting to note we both represented the same district at one point.
Yeah.
So we go back a long ways, and it's great to be here with Jerry. Keep Our Republic is a national group with a chapter here in Michigan of folks from both sides of the aisle and that are concerned about making sure that our elections there's integrity and that people understand that we have a safe and secure electoral system, and that there are people on the ground every day, from our clerks to our election workers to our election representatives and people that run those elections, that are working hard every day to maintain the sanctity of the ballot and to continue to have confidence in the system that we've had going since the founding of our republic.
Jerry, why is this important now? I mean, you know, if you go back and take a look at elections, and we could go back to 1960 and know that there was certainly angst when it came to the presidential election. In 2000, it was one of the longest and prolonged fights that ended up in the Supreme Court. In 2004, John Kerry had some questions about Pennsylvania. In 2016, Hillary Clinton did a stutter step before she was willing to accept the results of that presidential election. And we know what happened in 2020. But before what happened in 2020 and what happened January 6, 2021, Dick Gephardt and others had already called an alarm, sounded an alarm. And so we need to start this to try to make sure people understand, as we're living through a pandemic, we can still have a free and fair election. So what is the impetus for this right now?
Well, I think there's a concern, you know, from my perspective. The hallmark of a democracy is a fair, free electoral process that has integrity. And we've lost, there are folks in our country that have lost, for one reason or another, faith in that process. And what I think we're trying to do is restore that faith, that there is integrity, that there is a process, that it's sound, that their vote does matter, and that we need to approach these issues from a standpoint, in elections from a standpoint of there are winners and there are losers, and there has to be a civil understanding of how we treat the aftermath of that. And you listed off, you know, the numbers of elections that in a row that sort of have raised the concern. And I think what we want to try and do is bring it back down to a civil level. Go back to fundamentals in terms of teaching civics and civil approaches to our politics.
One of the hallmarks of the government in the United States that other nations have looked at for a couple of hundred years and marveled at is the peaceful transition of power after a presidential election. And as I pointed out, there have been a number of cases, and you can go back before that, including a famous newspaper headline from a guy from Missouri where it says, Dewey defeats Truman. I mean, there have always been anomalies in elections, but that peaceful transition of power has always happened until 2020. Now, I want to point out again, this group was founded prior to that January 6th issue. But in light of that, and in light of the attempts on the part of people around Donald Trump and Donald Trump trying to suggest that the outcome of the elections were somehow something other than what had been certified, how important does this become now to reach out to everyone, but particularly for those people who erroneously believed that there was something wrong with the election? How do you reach out to them and explain? I mean, I've had county clerks who I've known who have done this for a long time sit here and go through the meticulous process step by step by step. Still, people will email and say, but you know there was something that wasn't right, and I don't know how to counter that.
Yeah, so that's a challenging question, and I've been trying to think through that. I think it's educating the public on the electoral process itself. And the clerks in our state have done a fantastic job. And there are Republican county clerks and there are Democrat county clerks. And they come together and they're working together on these issues. I think some of the election reforms that have been recently passed in Michigan and others hopefully will help with some of that. But you know, it's how do we restore trust? And I think that's where folks like I and Brandon, but more importantly, folks at the national level who have been leaders in both parties saying, we trust the process. We were there. We understand the process that our counties and our states go through because we don't have a national election process. Each state has its own election laws. But the canvassing of those precincts following the election is a very vetted process. They're identifying how many people vote, you know, which people voted, and making sure that matches with the numbers of actual votes and ballots that came in. Then they do audits of that in various precincts. It's a very well-done process, and I think the public needs to understand that. And that, you know, in the state of Michigan, which, you know, there are still people, unfortunately, that believe that Trump won Michigan somehow. It's 150,000 plus votes that would have had a change. It's kind of hard to actually imagine how you could rig that many votes, right? It wasn't even close. If it's 100 votes, I've seen recall, or, you know, when they do recounts, and they'll move the numbers maybe on a statewide basis by a couple hundred, right? But 150,000.
And they usually go in the direction of the person that was already leading. That they end up with a bigger.
Very often.
Let me take issue with something you said. You said it's more maybe important on the national level than it is locally. I would suggest that taking two fellows who both served in the state house and been very involved in politics in the state from both sides of the aisle working together locally has a bigger impact, because people who know you have to then consider the veracity of your claims because they voted for both of you. They trusted you to serve in the legislature. But Brandon, I want to follow up with something Jerry said, and I don't mean this to be trite, but you've been in the legislature. You've worked with other politicians. Can you imagine enough people colluding, conspiring, and keeping it a secret to try to rig an election? I mean, if there are 3 politicians that know, there are 6 reporters that already know.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. And I'm not taking issue with anything Jerry said, because I do think there is a lot of folks are getting their cues from the national media now. So you have to have that kind of perspective. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of shows like this out there where you have an opportunity to talk to folks who are serving at the state or local level or have served and are still involved in government. But I would agree that, you know, the reason this is so important to have a chapter in a state like Michigan is Michigan is going to be a very important state this election. Everybody knows there's 5 or 6 swing states that matter, and Michigan's at the top of the list. And having folks, it's easy to say, oh, I don't believe that person who's some senator from New York or California, but when you have your local clerk who people have to interact with, maybe even at the grocery store or at church or at a sports function, and folks who have served on different sides of the aisle and battled on issues and elections. But at the end of the day, we all knew that the reason we either won or lost was not because the system was rigged, it's that the voters either didn't want us or didn't want the ideas that we had. And I think that's where we want to try to get back to, where people understand we can have tough, hard fights over policy and the direction of the country and the direction of our local community. But at the end of the day, the reason we have lasted this long as a country and been the envy of almost every other country in the world in terms of our democracy is because of that trust in the system and that ability to understand that even if I win this time, I may lose next time. And it keeps everybody hopefully working in the same direction to get a system that works. You're not always going to like the results. But if you don't have confidence in the system, then you should be looking around at the people who represent you and say, you know, I don't trust my county clerk or my city clerk or my township official. I think they get a different flavor when folks are actually talking about it and get into specifics.
I want to put a little finer point on what you talked about, Michigan being one of the swing states. This is going to air sometime after we record it. But as we sit here today, the Real Clear Politics average, and when you look at 270 to win, right now, Democrats need about 44 electoral votes to get to 270, and that's the magic number. There are 3 states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, that are all in play. Those 3 total 44 electoral votes. So Michigan certainly plays into that contour, perhaps for Democrats. If you look at Michigan, Georgia, and then Arizona or Nevada, they would give Republicans 270 electoral votes. Either way, Michigan is going to be kind of at the center of any of those arguments. And so how important is it right now, today, to start reassuring the public in a state that may be decided by a few thousand votes? I mean, that seems possible to me, that this is a fair election no matter who comes out the victor.
Well, it's one of the reasons we're here today, because you have to start early. People's perception of the electoral system either being rigged or not fair didn't just happen with one event. It happened over a period of time, as you've suggested, and I think part of that is the fact that, you know, people have different options for where they get their news and how they consume information. And we want to try to be out as early and often as possible, not just me and former Representative Coyman, but the other officials and folks who have signed up to be part of this effort, because they understand that, you know, what divides us on a partisan basis does not even come close to comparing to what unites us on our ability to be Americans and Michiganders and want to have a system that we all will have an opportunity to shape going forward.
Well, and one of the things, too, is if people don't trust the system, if they don't trust that their vote will be counted in that it's going to be a fair election, it has the potential for people to stay home, right? And that's the wrong. I think I said earlier, you know, the election, the electoral process is a foundational part of our democracy. I mean, the name of the organization, Keep Our Republic, came from Benjamin Franklin. When asked, do we have a republic or monarchy? He said, we have a republic if we can keep it. And I think we are at the point where, in this history of our nation, we risk having maybe not a monarchy, but an anarchy if there isn't a trust in the process. And it is a good process. Is it perfect? There's no such thing as perfect, but it is a very good, it's the envy of the world. In fact, we send people to monitor other elections in other countries, right? And I'm concerned about what it means for the future of this nation if we don't lower the concerns and begin to educate again the American public on the process and why it's important to their future and the future of the nation.
When you talk about our election process, it is the worst process in the world except for every other process
Exactly.
in the world. And so it really is a matter of making people understand why this works, but maybe more important, why it is vital that it continues to work. And speaking specifically to you, some of the people that you may have served with, that may have supported you, people that you have known, maybe some of the same people that are questioning this process. So how do you go to them, people that you've known, people that, that you've had fundraisers with, people that you've gone to county party meetings with and talked to about processes? How do you talk to them and say, look, we've known each other a long time, and I can tell you this process is not broken when some of them firmly believe that it is?
So one of the things I can do is I can talk about, at least locally, I know the city clerk personally. I know the county clerk personally in Kent County. I know the county clerk personally in Ottawa County. They all have Republican credentials, right? And in a myth out there is, something happened in Detroit that cost Donald Trump the election. Reality, Donald Trump lost in West Michigan, and he lost in Oakland County. Both segments of the state controlled by Republican county clerks who are overseeing the election process. People they need to realize that it was a fair election. And the election deniers are not looking at reality. I mean, they have been beaten at every court in the state and every court in the country. Not one court anywhere has ever ruled that there was illegality in the last election, presidential election.
And I would just say that I think that, there was always the incident up in Antrim County where but that was fixed almost immediately. It was confirmed by the local canvass. It was confirmed by the statewide canvass. There are processes and checks and balances. Those boards of canvassers are equally divided between Democrats and Republicans, so they have to agree on it. It is just, it's a situation where you're fighting against a constant noise machine. I think there's certain folks that want to continue to propagate this belief that the elections aren't secure in this country. And that's why I think it's so important to have folks that people either have seen and trusted. They may not just agree with them on every policy position they take, but they know that, especially for people like me, I've lost elections. I was upset. I didn't like it, but I never suggested that Jerry was out trying to rig the ballot against me. I just lost. And the flip side is true too. When you win, you accept the results gracefully and get ready for the next election.
Yeah.
And if I could I think what's happened in the last decade is the advent of social media, which only adds to the volume out there of those who are naysayers, those who are deniers of the electoral process.
And disinformation.
And disinformation. And it just multiplies much more than you talked about the 60s. Well, yes, there were some concerns, but you didn't have it magnified in social media every minute of every day. And that's, I think, a huge change.
And without going back and relitigating history, it didn't take Richard Nixon long to start tamping down that notion too, maybe for a lot of different political reasons. But it was a different approach because people that were involved in politics at that point, who certainly had their own personal problems, and ultimately some of those were laid bare for the rest of the nation, but they still wanted to have integrity in the process. And that really is the thing that may become the most important as we kind of wrap up this conversation. I want to hear from both of you on this. We know Michigan is going to be tight, and we know that it's going to be hard fought. And when it is over, because we will have 40 days of absentee ballots, because we will have at least 9 days of in-person voting, there will be a lot of ballots cast before what we think of as Election Day. I think increasingly we're going to start calling that day Results Day because the election goes on for a long, long time. How do you convince people that all of those votes that have been cast over that long tunnel of time remain secure, remain safe, because now they can be prepared. And so they can't be tallied, but they can be prepared. It's a lot of time for ballots to be sitting around. How important is it going to be to explain the chain of custody of those ballots to make people understand they're safe?
Well, I think, that's an important exercise, even if people weren't, there wasn't this kind of talk about the election process being not sound and secure. Educating people about the chain of custody and the way that there are checks and balances at each. I mean, this is not a new concept that Michigan's doing by processing absentee ballots. States like Florida have done it for years, and it's one of the reasons when you watch an election night, those Florida results come in, you got them. It's the absentees. And I think that's important. One of the issues that happened in 2020 was, people made a big deal about ballots coming in late, but that was a matter of public policy that the legislature and the voters decided to change. I think if you do the work up front to explain people what's going on, and people want to vote absentee, a lot of people, Republicans were kicking Democrats' butt on absentee ballots long before 2020. So I think it'll actually help when the results are able to come in pretty much all at once, and you don't see this kind of mirage where one side goes up early on the absentee vote and the other side catches up with the election day votes, that we have the votes, we count them, that's it, and then the process to ensure that those were counted correctly proceeds afterwards.
Yeah, and if you think about it, in just 24 years, all of those problems that were in Florida have been dealt with, and they were dealt with quickly and nationally with the Helping Americans Vote Act with Secretary of State Terry Lynn Land from Michigan, a Republican, had a big hand in restructuring that. So Jerry, I'll give you the final word. What do you do as this election comes about? And I don't like to make predictions, but as we sit here now early in the cycle, Michigan is going to be a hotbed of activity. And when that vote comes in, Michigan could be the deciding electoral vote, even on election night. By the time we get to Michigan, we may be able to look at the numbers and say, this is it. How do you make sure that everybody on both sides is going to say, yep, that's fair?
That's a challenge. I mean, it'd be great if we could just say, oh, okay, we're all good. The election's over. I think, it's the work up until there. That the process is defined, that the chain of where those ballots go is well defined. I do think a big part of 2020 was the fact that more Republicans voted in person because the candidate for president was telling them to vote in person, and more Democrats voted early and voted through absentee, and those ballots couldn't be counted. And so, former President Trump had this big lead, and all of a sudden he lost, right? And it's because all those absentee ballots were counted, and that created this level of distrust. So I do think, having that those ballots already processed, not tabulated, before Election Day will be very helpful, because you won't have this huge time frame difference between those who cast ballots in person at a precinct and those who voted early somewhere in their community, or they voted by absentee. So I think that will be one of those issues, but it's really going to be what leads up to it, in urging calm on all sides, and then let the process go. Let the canvassers, who are 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, do their process at the local level. Let them do a process at the state level to verify the results, because that happens, election night, we don't have winners and losers yet. It's not until the canvassing process is completed. And then after that, there's a whole auditing process. And so I think getting the word out in terms of the full process is really important.
Gentlemen, I appreciate the conversation. I appreciate you both being here. Kind of like we got the band back together, but it's great.
It's an old band.
It is, but I'm delighted to have you here. I hope you come back sometime during the cycle, and we'll talk a little bit more about the process, or maybe some of what you're seeing out there, because this is going to be an important conversation, not just for your group, but for every voter and everybody watching the show. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
We're out of time this week. Join me again next time. To the Point.